All right, let's take a look at what HTML is. So what is HTML? HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. It's actually not a programming language. It's called a scripting language, but it's still absolutely vital to web development. And 100% of all websites use HTML. HTML is the structure behind every website on the internet. It's the backbone behind every single website. And then we layer code on top of HTML, but without HTML, honestly, there is no website. And this isn't an opinion, this is just a fact. This is how websites and the internet work. So the first thing you should learn in web development is HTML. Let's take a look at HTML versus HTML5. You will often see people say, learn HTML5 or HTML5 this or HTML5 that. But HTML5 is actually the last version of HTML, and it will just always be called HTML5, and eventually it'll just be called HTML. So there's no HTML6 down the road. There's no sixth iteration of HTML. So whenever you see HTML5, you can actually think of HTML5 and HTML as the exact same thing, and that's because they are the exact same thing. Okay, let's take a look at getting set up. First, you're going to need a text editor. I highly suggest VS Code. It's free and it works on all operating systems. So before we do anything, let's make sure we have VS Code installed. And I'm just going to Google this, VS Code download, and it's code.visualstudio.com. And this is the text editing program we're going to be using in this course. Now, if you have already written code and you have a different text editor that you prefer, that's okay. But if you've never written code before, let's go ahead and download this program. So for me, in this course, I'm using a Mac, but it doesn't matter if you're using Mac or Linux or Windows. It's going to be the same program right across all three operating systems. So if you're on Windows 7, 8, or 10, make sure you download this one. If you're on Mac, download this one. And if you're on Linux, download one of these two. Once you have VS Code downloaded and installed, make sure you can open up your text editor, just like this. So yours is going to look a little bit different once you open it. Yours is going to be a different color, but ultimately it's the exact same program. Mine's just a different color because I like the accessibility behind it. I like being able to type stuff in here. And it's a fairly easy color for you to read on your screen. So yours is going to look a little bit different in colors, but the general layout is going to be the exact same. So make sure you have VS Code downloaded and installed. And once you have that, let's head on over to that next lesson. Okie doke, let's take a look at HTML syntax. Now the word I'm saying here is syntax. And all that means is the styling in which you write something. So English has particular syntax with apostrophes, periods, question marks, commas, things like that. It's like a markup for how we write a language. And writing code is no different. There are certain rules that we have in place. So first things first, let's go ahead and let's look at some HTML syntax. So typically it looks like this. We have some sort of element and it opens like this and closes like this. So each one of these is called a tag. This is an opening tag and this is a closing tag. And it always has a less than sign, then the word of the element, whichever element is, and there's lots of them, and then a greater than sign. And then to end an element, we do same thing. We open it. And then we say, actually, this is not an opening element, this is a closing element. We say that with a slash, and then the word. And then we close it again with a greater than sign or symbol. Now you may have noticed that I put this on a different line, and that's actually okay. HTML doesn't really care about extra white space, so this does not really matter. All these extra lines between line 4 and line 11, it doesn't really matter, to be honest. We'll talk about that more in depth a little bit later. So this whole thing right here, that is called an element. Now inside of these elements, we can have text. So we could say some text in here. And what our browser is going to do is then say, hey, there's a particular element here and it's closing here. And whatever is on the inside, apply these rules to it. So whatever the element rule is, maybe it's bold. Make this text bold is what it's going to do. And we'll talk about bold in the future as well. But right now, also, you need to know that element is not actually a real element. We're just going over syntax here, just so this makes sense in the next few lessons. The other thing that we can have are these things called attributes. And this actually goes inside of an element. So what I'm going to do is split this onto its own line and That's okay. It's going to be basically the exact same thing to your browser because, again, it doesn't care about this extra space in there. So we have these things called attributes, and it goes attribute name is equal to, and then you can either have 2 apostrophes like this or 2 quotation marks like this. And then we could put some value in here, some sort of text. So we could say some text in here. Now we can have multiple attributes. We can have, let's say, a title attribute. And again, you don't need to know what this is. We'll cover all this in future lessons. Again, we're just going over syntax here. And this is an example of a second attribute. Second attribute here. We can have more and more and more. We can actually have unlimited number of attributes. Now, attributes are just like elements. An element has a rule that your browser is going to read. So if this were to be bold, your browser would say bold this text. And just because I write attribute in here does not actually mean it's going to do anything. Now, a good example of this, because this is not actually valuable whatsoever, attribute is not a valid attribute in HTML, we could just write title is equal to, and then whatever the title is. And title is actually a proper attribute, and you can add this to most of your HTML elements. Again, we'll talk about that in the future. You don't need to memorize all this either, because as you write this, as your fingers start to type more and more, you're going to become more familiar with how HTML works and how it looks. So the big takeaway here is this is your element. You've got an opening tag, and this whole thing is a tag. You've got a closing tag, and everything it encompasses is your element. Next, we have attributes, like the title attribute. And then so it goes, the attribute name is equal to, you need that equal sign. Don't add spaces before or after, make sure it's all together. So you've got your attribute is equal to, and then either quotations or apostrophes. Now here's the catch, is if it opens with a quotation mark, it needs to end with a quotation mark. Otherwise, if it opens with an apostrophe, it needs to close with an apostrophe. And you can actually see VS Code highlighted this for me. It says everything down here is all the same. And that's called syntax highlighting. But as soon as I replace that quotation with an apostrophe, because this attribute needs to open and close with the exact same character, the syntax highlighting worked. Now, if your syntax highlighting doesn't work right away and you're following this video and you're trying to do what I'm doing, go down here, and this is probably going to say plain text. You can click this, and you can type in HTML, and just click this one, and it will change your syntax highlighting for you. So that's all there is to this particular lesson. You don't need to do anything at this point in time. It's just really important to know that this whole thing is an element. This is an opening tag. This is a closing tag. This is your inner content. And this fella right here is an attribute. Let that sink in for just a moment. Once you're ready, let's head on over to that next lesson where we talk about the base HTML structure of every page. Okay, let's take a look at the base structure of every single web page. So I have VS Code open here, and I'm just going to go to File, New. That's actually outside of my recording area, so it's just Command N or Control N or File, New File. And you're going to see this brand new file here. Let's go ahead and change this from plain text to HTML. And what we can do here is automatically fill. So we have a nice shortcut here, so we don't have to remember this. It's HTML:5, and then if you hit Tab, it should autocomplete for you using the Emmet abbreviation. You can see that on the right side of my screen here. So let's go ahead and hit Tab, and it does all this stuff for me. Now I'm gonna go ahead and delete a few things just because we don't need it right now, and it might be a little bit confusing. And I'm just gonna change this indenting just so we can look at some nesting, and I'll talk about that in just a second. But let's go through this line by line. So line number 1, this is the weirdest kind of element you're going to see. You don't see elements too often starting with an exclamation mark. Doc type is the only one. So we're saying, hey browser, when you read this file, know that it's an HTML5 file. It's an HTML file. It's not a PDF, it's not plain text, it's not JavaScript, it's not CSS, it's not an image, it's not a font, it's not some sort of other document, it is an HTML page, so please render it like an HTML page. Next, on line 2, we have an opening tag called HTML, and this is where all of our HTML actually goes. And then on line 9, we're closing that tag, so we're saying everything in here is going to live inside of this HTML tag. And In VS Code, you can actually click this little arrow and you can collapse it, which is really nice. So if you ever have too much code and you're getting a little overwhelmed, you can always collapse your code. Next, we have two main parts to every single page. We have our head. Again, that's an opening head element, or a tag rather. And this is a closing head tag. And this whole thing is the head element. Now you can actually see that just like HTML, we have another element in here called title, but this one is nested inside of head and head is nested inside of HTML. And then we have a title element here that just changes the title of the page. So when you go to a web page, such as this one, when we downloaded VS Code a couple of lessons ago, it changes this title up here for you. That's what the title element does. Now you can have all sorts of things in your head, but you can think of the head element as literally the head on your body. It's your brain. It holds all this extra information. So it's not completely visual, but it does hold extra information. Now your body is just like the body that you live in. It is what people are going to see. So if I flip back to this page, just as an example, everything in here is part of the body. So everything that's visual, the interactive part of your web page, that is the body. And we're going to be putting most of our code in there. So let's go ahead and make an example here. And let's just write hello world. And what I'm going to do is save this. So file, save as, and where should I throw this? Let's throw this on my desktop. I'm going to call this hello world.html. I already have one, so let's go ahead and replace that. Now what I can do in my browser is again, I can go to File, but this time I'm going to go to Open File. So it's Command O or Control O if you're on Windows, I believe. Let's go to Desktop, and let's open up Hello World. And this is a web page. Now, if you're following this video, definitely feel free to pause at this point and try to write out the code that I have written in this video. It's not very much code, and it's really easy to write with VS Code. Remember HTML:5 and then hit Tab, and that will autocomplete all of that for you. And then just write something inside of your body element. So I just wrote hello world, and that showed up as text on my page. If you do that, save your file and then open it in your browser, and you see hello world, then hey, congratulations, you have literally just made your first web page. So my suggestion is give that a shot, because this is always really, really good practice, and this is really straightforward at this point. So yeah, my suggestion is give this a shot once you're happy with your results, or maybe you don't want to give this a shot and you just want to move on to that next lesson. Either way, let's head on over to that next lesson together, and we'll get started talking about the title element. Okay, hello and welcome back. In this lesson, let's go ahead and talk about this fella right here, the title element. So in the last lesson, we created this page called Hello World, and I'm just going to delete this. And this is the page that we originally had, and it said document up there, right in that tab. So let's go ahead and refresh this, and we're going to see it just says the file name, and that matches the file name here. So hello_world.html, hello_world.html. Same thing, not really elegant, not what your users are looking for, not search engine friendly. But we can change that with a title element. And so I'm going to write title/title. Let's go ahead. Mine's set to a Django template, but I want to change this from a Django template to an HTML file. So let's go ahead here and change this title. Let's say, hello from Caleb. And refresh. And you can always refresh with Command R or I believe Control R. I'm just using Google Chrome, by the way. It doesn't really matter what browser you're using. But you can just reload the page and it says hello from Caleb. And you can change that at any point in time. We could say hello from Earth. You could do file save, or you can hit Control S or Command S, I believe it is. Yep, Command S on a Mac. I believe it's Control S on Windows. Just go ahead and save that file. Let's go back here, refresh this page. Hello from Earth. And so that's the title tag. Now, you should only ever have one title tag because it's only really ever used once. Having two title tags, your browser's not going to know which one to use, so just make sure you only have the one title tag. Now, the thing about this particular element, this title element, it has to live inside of the head element, and that has to live inside of your HTML element. So now we're getting into nesting. We've got this HTML element, and inside of it, we have head, title, closing element, and we have body, content, closing element. And that's all there is to creating a title in a tab up here using HTML. Nice and easy. Once you're feeling comfortable with that, let's head on over to that next lesson and we'll get started with adding some actual content to our page. So it doesn't just say hello world, it's going to say hello world and maybe a title. We could write a paragraph, we could add multiple titles, things like that. Okay, let's take a look at paragraphs and headers. And this is where a page is going to actually start to take a little extra shape here. So it's not just going to say hello world. Now, a paragraph, and like a lot of elements in HTML, is just a p tag. But because it's an element, it's a pretty standard element, we could do p and then we do /p. And this is, again, this is just our syntax. This is our opening tag, our closing tag, and the whole thing together is an element. So P stands for paragraph, but we don't write paragraph. We just write P for paragraph. In here, we can either write some text here, or if you want to keep your code nice and clean, we can go ahead and put it on separate lines. So I'm just going to keep these on separate lines. I think it looks a little cleaner this way. What I'm going to do is type lorem, hit tab, and it fills my text area with a bunch of lorem ipsum Latin words. I have no idea what this means, but it's a common thing you're going to see in web development. So let's go ahead and save. So you can go up to File, Save, or Command S or Control S on Windows. Let's go back to the page we're creating and hit refresh. And now we have this lorem ipsum text. Now let's go ahead and create a title for this page, a header. So just inside of the body, above the P element, not inside of it, but above it, we're going to write H1. And the nice thing about VS Code is when you write an element, whenever it says Emmet abbreviation, you can just hit tab. So I hit tab and it writes my code for me, and then I can just write something on the inside. You can say, welcome to HTML 101. Let's go ahead, save that page, flip back to our browser and hit refresh. We have this big text in here, HTML, welcome to HTML 101, and then lorem ipsum in here. Now, if this looks smaller on your screen, it's because I'm actually zoomed in to 175%. Yours should look something a little more like this. I just made this bigger so it's easier to see on your screen. Now, that's not the only size title we can have. We can have H2, H3, H4, H5, and H6 elements. So let's go ahead and create an H2 tag, and this could be like a subtitle. A beginner's guide to coding. And so you can see I'm getting a little bit faster here, but the syntax stays the same. This is an opening HTML tag, an H2 tag, and this is a closing one. Again, you got that slash, and then the element name, and that just says everything inside of here needs to be an H2 font size. And everything in the H1, between the two H1 tags, needs to be super large. And everything between the two paragraph tags is your paragraph, just general text for the most part. So save that. Let's flip back over here and let's see what an H2 looks like. It should be right between these two sections of text. And you can see it's a little bit smaller. Now, what I would like you to do for some hands-on experience right now is create an H1, H2, but then also create an H3, create an H4, H5, and an H6. And again, all I'm doing here is typing an element name. As soon as Emmet abbreviation comes up, I can hit tab, and it creates the H6 element for me. So go ahead and take a look at what H1 through H6 looks like. Add some extra text in here. LOL, BBQ. Go ahead and save that. And when you flip over this page and hit refresh, check out the different header sizes. And you might be a little bit surprised what an H6 looks like. Whitespace does not matter. Now, I mentioned this really early on, but whitespace does not matter. You can see that I actually have an element right here, an H2. Actually, this whole thing is an element. And I don't have any spacing or new lines or anything. It's just an H2 opening tag, a bunch of text, and then an H2 closing tag. But with a paragraph, I have the P element here, and then I've actually broken this onto a new line, added a bunch of extra spaces in here. And then at the very end, again, I broke it onto a new line, a bunch of extra spaces. Now, your browser does not care how many spaces there are. It's going to try to condense it all down into one space anyways. So as an example, let's go ahead and add a space just after the word ipsum. Just gonna add a bunch of spaces. Now, if we were writing a newspaper article, this would look terrible. It would be 2 words, a comma, and then all these different spaces. And those little dots that you see after I highlight the space, that just tells me it's a space. That's not actually there, it's just telling me there's a space. So let's go ahead, save that, head on over to your browser, and let's hit refresh, and we're going to see, as soon as I hit refresh, absolutely nothing is going to change. So let's reload this page. I can reload this 100 times, nothing looks like it changes. However, if we click somewhere on the page, we can go right-click, view page source, and we can see all of our source code. And this is exactly what I've written in VS Code. And you can see that all the spaces are there. But your browser says, no, you don't need all those spaces. Let's compress that into just one visual space. So Whitespace does not matter. Another example here is I could add all these new lines, and there's a bunch of new lines. You can actually see there's so many new lines that I can't even really read the code anymore. And let's go ahead and add some more lorem in here. So lorem tab, and I should have 2 paragraphs, right? I should have this first paragraph, and I can get rid of this white space because it does not matter. I have 3 new lines, and then I have another paragraph. Now, intuitively, you would think it would create 2 paragraphs for us. It's not going to do that. So if I save this, flip on over to the browser, what you're going to see is these are combined together. And again, it took all of those new lines and squished it into one single space for you. Now, if you want multiple paragraphs, what you have to do is you have to close this paragraph element. Let's close that paragraph element, and this creates its first paragraph. Let's collapse that, and let's go up here. And we just have to reopen this, and I'm going to show you what I'm doing here in just a second. And so all I did was I closed that first element up here, and I reopened a new one down here. So if we take a look at this together, we have paragraph 1, paragraph 2. They're not nested. It's not a paragraph inside of a paragraph. It's a paragraph, and then we close it, and then a second paragraph, and then we close that. So let's go ahead and click save. And now when we refresh our page, we're going to see that this is actually 2 separate paragraphs, the way we probably wanted it to be in the first place. So the lesson here is whitespace does not matter. If you want to use extra whitespace, there are ways to do that, such as wrapping your text in different paragraphs or different H1s or different H2s. And as just one more example, let's go ahead and let's see what happens when I put this is on a new line right in my H1, just to demonstrate that this is not specific just to paragraphs either. So I'm going to save that, go over here, hit refresh, and it's not on a new line. And again, that's because our browser does not care. Even though we've written the code that way, our browser does not care that it has this extra white space. So I'm just going to go ahead, clean this up, just delete that extra white space because I like my code to be nice and tidy. And this is what we're left with. Next up, let's take a look at nesting elements a little bit more. We've actually already been doing it with HTML, head, title, body, H1, H2, and paragraph. These are nesting, but let's get into some terminology. Alrighty, let's take a look at nesting some code. So we've actually already been nesting our HTML. And what that means is we have an HTML element, and then inside of that, instead of just regular text like we see with a paragraph or heading 1, heading 2, we have another element. And then we can have another element. And this can go on essentially forever. Now, what I'm going to do is scroll down my page just below my 2 paragraphs that I have. And I'm going to create a new element called a div. Or if you want to use the Emmet abbreviation, div. And then as soon as you see Emmet abbreviation over here, go ahead, hit the tab letter on your keyboard, and it fills it for you. Now, a div honestly doesn't mean anything. We'll talk more about divs down the road, but it doesn't do anything. Like a paragraph is going to separate your text with, for instance, a paragraph is going to separate your text here. It's got like a nice little spacing in there, and then it creates another one for you. A div does not really do that. So let's go ahead and say this is a div element. Go ahead, save that, refresh our page, and it's going to say this is a div element. And now inside of this element, and this is going to look a little bit weird at first, but we have a div element, and then we can have some text in there. We can have another div in here as well. We can say div this is a nested element. And we'll close that one off as well. Let's go ahead and refresh this page. And we're going to see it shows up on the line right after it. But this whole thing is wrapped in one div. Now, a good way to look at this is right-click on your page, go to Inspect. And I'm just going to make this a little bit bigger here. Whoops, that was too big. And let's scroll back down. And we can hover over the elements in here. And so this is our Inspect tool. It is incredibly helpful. You're going to want to use this for pretty much everything front-end related, so HTML, CSS, and JavaScript down the road. But for now, let's just stick with HTML. And what we have here is a div. And we can open up this div, and we can see that there's some text. And you can see that as I hover over it, it's actually changing what is selected on my page. And then we've got a child element, and that's what it's called. When it's nested, it's a child element. And that's on its second line. Now we can actually go one layer deeper as well. So I'm just gonna put this on a new line just to keep code nice and tidy. And I could do one more div, or let's experiment and let's do a paragraph inside of a div. This is a paragraph. Go ahead, save that, flip on over to my browser, and I'm just gonna hit refresh here. And you can see as I hover over things, it's going to show me what exactly is selected. So I have a div element here, and it's selecting both the nested div and the paragraph. Whereas up here, it's just selecting the one paragraph at a time. You can see that as I flip between them. So here I've got the overarching, the container element called div, and then I've got some text, and then I've got another div, and then I've got inside of that div, a paragraph. Or I've got text here, and then I've got a paragraph here. And you can actually see that that paragraph has a bunch of spacing around it, so it sort of bumps your text down a little bit. Now let's take a look at some terminology here. This one here, this is going to be your parent element, and this is going to be a child element. So what this typically looks like is you've got some sort of parent element, /parent, and then a closing tag like that. And then you've got some sort of child element, and then you close that tag there. Again, it doesn't matter if you have extra white space. You could put that on multiple lines if you wanted to, which I'm actually going to do. And then we could go one layer deeper, and we could call this a grandchild element /grandchild. And this can go on and on and on forever. So we can say great grandchild. And it goes on and on and on. Now the terminology is going to change based on what you're talking about. So if I get rid of grandchild and great grandchild, when we're working in here, this is our main element. Let's just call it child. And if we're talking about the element around it, the one that wraps around it like this, that's called a parent element. Now, if we're working on the parent element and we want to talk about an element inside of it, we would call it a child. Now, where the terminology changes is if we have grandchild element, and this is the one we're working on, this is our main element. Let's say we're talking with a coworker about this particular element. We would just call this the element, whichever one it is. Maybe it's a div. Child would then become the parent. Parent would then become the grandparent. And so it's relative, just like in a family hierarchy. Now, none of these are actually real elements, so let's go ahead and delete those. And just for funsies, let's go ahead and let's add an H3 element in here, just a little title that says this is an example of element nesting. So I saved that file, and I'm going to refresh this. And let's close our inspect tool with this X over here. This is an example of element nesting, and this is all in one element. Now, in the next lesson, we're going to see why nesting is actually very, very important, because right now, this was not very important. We didn't have to nest this at all, but we needed to know how this works in order to get to that next lesson. So in the next lesson, let's take a look at bolding, italicizing, and underlining your text, and then we're going to mix and match all three of them. All right, welcome back from the nesting video. Let's go ahead and actually create something applicable here. So I'm going to just make some space to work just because I like a lot of extra space. And again, white space doesn't matter. We know that, right? So let's create a new paragraph in here, and let's automatically close that paragraph tag. And in here, let's write lorem, hit tab, and we get some lorem ipsum, just like we've done before. Now, if we want to bold some text, You think it would be the word bold. It's not quite that intuitive, but it's pretty close. We just use the B tag. So we could do B, and let's bold the first 4 letters, or words rather. And so I've got a P tag, a paragraph, and nested as a child element is the bold element. And so I saved that, and if I go over to Google Chrome and hit refresh, you can actually see that my text here is bold and the rest is not bold. Okay, so this is nesting, and this is actually getting into something a little more interesting, a little more useful, a little more applicable to actually learning HTML. Next, let's go ahead and let's italicize. So italicize to make something sort of, actually this is a good example. Whatever I did there made this italics. So it's sort of kind of handwriting-ish. Let's go ahead and add an I element to these 3 words. And so if I refresh the page, which ones do we have here? Culpa iustu, I'm not even gonna try to say that, but it's these 3 words here. And if I hit refresh, we can see that that has now automatically changed. Lastly, we have underline, and really it's the exact same thing. So you'd think it would be underline, but it's not. We use sort of shorthand when it comes to HTML, and we just say U. It's the U element. And again, that has an opening and closing tag. All 3 of these have opening and closing tags. So I'm going to save that, come back here, hit refresh, and we can see this is now underlined. Now, where this gets really, really interesting is we can create another paragraph and lower them, and you see how fast this is getting because I have that tab completion. If I wanted to make this bold, italic, and underlined, and let's just get rid of this. Let's do only 1 line instead of 2 or 3 sentences there. Let's just do 1 sentence. I could say B, hit tab, makes bold for me, and then it wants me to put my text in here. Well, that's nice, but what I'm going to do here is just grab all of that. I'm going to hit Control X or Command X on Mac. That just cuts it into my clipboard, and then Control V or Command V, as in violet, to paste. And so when I save, refresh, we're going to see we now have a bold sentence. Now, if we wanted to make this italics as well, it's not BI for bold italics, it's just B, and then inside of it, we say I. So then we can go over here, hit tab to indent that some more, and /I. One thing to note too is your text might actually scroll way off the screen over here. You can go into your settings and you can change your word wrapping or your text wrapping settings so that it breaks automatically onto a new line. So you can see that this whole thing for me is line 27, even though it's spanning multiple lines. That's just so it's not one long line right across the page and I have to scroll left and right. Okay, so I added a paragraph, bold, italics. Let's go ahead, save and refresh. And now this is bold and italicized. So that's working out pretty nicely. Lastly, let's add a U element. And I just move that text up real quick. Go ahead, save that file, refresh, and now we can see it's bold, italic, and underlined. But there is a rule here. Your inner tag, your innermost tag, has to have an innermost closing tag. So if the last one you have is a U, the first closing tag is a U. If the second element that you have here is an I, the second last one is a /I. Same thing with bold. So we start with bold up here and we close, and you can actually see, and this is why I indented it like this, is so that you can see that these match up this way. You always want your elements to match up this way. Funny things can happen if you don't match your opening and closing tags. That's pretty important. So at this point, if you want to go ahead and give this a shot, let's try nesting a paragraph. So create a paragraph element, then bold your text, italicize your text, underline your text, and it doesn't matter if it's bold, italic, or underline, or any other order. It could be italic, underline, bold. It could be underline, bold, italic. It doesn't really matter as long as these match up. And then add some text in there. And I want you to make sure that your text is both, or not both, but all. It should be bold, italic, and underlined, and it should be in a paragraph element. Go ahead and give that a shot. Once you're ready to move on, I'll see you in that next lesson. Okay, hello, and welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to be talking about a div element. So what I want to do here is I have a bunch of code already, and I just want to collapse it so it's a little more readable for me. because this is getting fairly long. And get rid of that extra white space, just because I like my code being tidy. And if we wanted to, we could like collapse just the I, just the B, just the paragraph. But in this lesson, let's go ahead and talk about div. Div is a dummy element. And it actually doesn't mean anything. So like how we said P stands for paragraph, B stands for bold, I stands for italic, div is just a divider. And you can actually see that the MDN reference here from VS Code says the div element has no special meaning at all. It represents its children. It can be used with class, lang, and title attributes to mark up semantics, comment, blah, blah, blah. That stuff's getting a little too advanced for us at the moment. But basically, that first line that says the div element has no special meaning at all. That's important. It has no special meaning. Now, what we're going to talk about here is A, div has no special meaning. This has no special meaning. But let's also take a look at how it works side by side, because in this last lesson where we did bold, italics, and underline, we could use all three of these. And actually a better example is this one where we had a paragraph, but then we had bold, and that bold text was beside the regular text. And then we had italics, and that italicized text was right beside the normal text. And the underlined text, same thing over and over and over again. And this gets into this concept of block elements versus inline elements. So a div is a block element. And what I mean by that is if I just hit Command C or Control C and then Command V or Control V, I just copied that whole line over. And this is a second line. So let's go ahead and save that, refresh our page here. And you can see down here, it just says, this has no special meaning. This is a second line. And if I do this, right click and inspect. When I hover over the element, you can actually see that that blue line that goes right across the entire page, that is a block element. So even though it's only actually needing the space from this has no special meaning, you can actually see that it's taking up the entire line. That's called a block element. And you're going to see these all the time because it's really good to know. The reason for that is because, for example, if this paragraph up here was not a block element, these two paragraphs would merge together and they wouldn't actually be paragraphs. It'd be one paragraph merged with the second paragraph to make one big one. That's not what we want all the time. And so the nice thing about this paragraph is also a block element, is it's going to take up the full width of your screen. It's going to take up as much real estate as it possibly can. So let's go back to our code and let's even try to put these side by side in our code. So it's opening one div and closing it, opening another div and closing it. Let's go ahead and save that, refresh, and we're going to see that nothing has changed. Nothing has changed. Literally nothing has changed. And that's, again, because these are block elements. So our browser said, okay, you have one element, it's closing, another element, it's closing. In the inspect tool, this is exactly what our browser sees. This has been fixed for us. So it's on two different lines. And again, they're both block elements, so they're going to take up as much possible space as they can, separated by the element itself. Now, this is a strange concept, but in the next lesson, we're going to talk about block elements versus inline elements and how you can use them sort of together and what the difference is. Okay, let's take a look at block elements versus inline elements. So far, we've been working with mostly block elements. Now, a block element is if I right-click and inspect, you can see that it takes up the entire width of my page. Even though it's actually only using, 30% of the text, it's actually saying, allocate the entire width of the page for this particular H2 element. Paragraphs are block elements as well. H3s, H4, 5, 6, even the H1 at the very top of the page. But what isn't is if we go down here, we have this particular paragraph with nested elements. Now the nesting has nothing to do with it. What's important to note is that this B element for bold, it's not taking up the entire width of the entire page. It's actually sitting side by side with your regular text. And then we have italics, regular text, underline, and then some more regular text. Now, underline, italic, and bold, these are called inline elements. And all that means is they can exist side by side with other elements. Whereas paragraph, you can see that I only have text up until about here. If I hover over this, to the right of where I selected that text, it's still taking up that extra space. That's a block element. Now, you do not need to have inline elements inside of a block element, though typically that is what you're going to end up doing, but there's no rule for that. It's just, this is an inline element, and we could put italics right beside bold, right beside underline. It doesn't really matter because it's an inline element, so it's going to take up the least amount of space possible. Versus block elements, like down here, this div is a block element, this div is a block element, and it's going to take up the entire width. Now, a couple use cases is, bold, italic, and underline, but also, if you wanted a block element, you could use a title, like an H1 through H6, and that's going to put your larger text on its own line. And so what's nice about that is we already have a title here, Welcome to HTML 101. We've got a subtitle here using an H2 element, and then we have a couple of paragraphs. These are all block elements, and this is what's making our page look nice. Now, if, for some reason, this bold were a block element, and I'm going to show you what this is going to look like, but don't try this. I don't want you to try this because this is breaking out of the scope of HTML, but I'm going to show you what this looks like. Display block. So what I just wrote there, you don't need to try. But I changed it. I hijacked its default behavior to be block instead of inline. And you can see that bold is now on its own line. And this is why inline elements are very important, because if you have bold on its own line, you'll never actually have the ability to select a particular piece of text in a paragraph and make it bold, underline, or italic. Now, there are a lot of different elements out there that are inline, and there's a lot of them that are block. And so you're going to have to sort of discover these as you move through learning HTML. There's too many elements to possibly cover. There's probably hundreds of them. But for the most part, you're going to use a handful of them pretty much every single day. And you need to know the difference between a block element, like this one that I hijacked, or an inline element, so that you can actually make your text presentable in a human readable manner. So that's the difference between block elements and inline elements. Okay, so the web is made of links to other pages. That's really all it is. So I have one page here, but what if I wanted to link to Google? Or what if I wanted to link to another page of mine? First things first, let's start off by using the most simple form. Let's just link to Google or Facebook or Instagram or something like that. So in this lesson, we're going to create two different types of links. The first one, and I just flipped over to VS Code here. The first one is going to be a link just to Google. And this is an absolute link. The second one is going to be a relative link. So a link starts with the A element, and this stands for anchor. It's a hypertext anchor. We can see that over here. Thank you, VS Code, for filling that in for me. So we have an anchor tag, and this actually uses our first attribute. We haven't used an attribute yet. And that's going to be href, and that stands for a hypertext reference. And basically, this is how we're going to point to another web page. Now, it's been a little while, but an attribute is always the attribute name, equal, and then either quotations or apostrophes. They have to start and end with the same. It doesn't matter which one you use, but it has to start and end with the same. And let's go ahead and close this A tag. And let's say this is a link. And let's see what happens. When I go back here and refresh my page, looks like a link. But when I click it, it doesn't actually go anywhere. So what I want to do here is href is equal to, and I want the full link to any website, including the HTTP part. That's vital. You need the HTTP every single time you want an absolute link. So let's go ahead and go to Instagram.com. So all I did there was HTTP or HTTPS. Most websites have that S these days. :// and then the website, so Instagram.com. And actually this slash isn't even necessary. Let's go ahead and save that and refresh. And when I go over here, you can see the link has actually changed to a blue because I haven't clicked it yet. And let's click the link. And look at that, it brought me to Instagram. So I'm gonna go back, and maybe I don't want Instagram. Maybe I want something a little less personal. Let's go to Google. So go ahead, save, refresh. And you can see at the bottom left, it says https google.com. Click that, and boom, it brings us to Google. And that's all there is to really adding a link to any page that you have. So again, it's the A element for anchor, the href attribute is equal to quotation and then your website URL, that link, and then some text. So we can say this is going to go to Google. And because that's going on to 2 lines in my editor, I'm just gonna put this on 2 different lines. And again, whitespace does not matter. So it doesn't matter that I have all these different spaces in here. I can still go back to my browser, hit refresh. The only thing that changes is the text, not the extra spacing. And so it changed the text. This is going to go to Google. And it does. Now that's nice, but what if you want to link to your own web page? Well, that's a little bit different because you can see up here, there's no HTTPS. This is a file, and you could theoretically link to it, but you don't want to because, well, I'm on a Mac, so it starts with file, but if you're on Windows, it starts with C. And if you're on Linux, it's just a slash. So it's not going to work for everybody, and we need to make sure that works on every operating system. And the way we get around that is using a relative link. So a relative link looks almost identical to an absolute link or an absolute anchor. We can do href is equal to, we have our quotations in here, and let's go and say second page.html. We'll close that opening tag and say this goes to the second page. And we always close, anytime we have text inside of an element, we always close it with a closing tag. And let's take a look at this. And we can see these links are side by side. So we know from the last lesson that these are inline elements because they work side by side, which means we could put them inside of a paragraph nicely. And when I click this goes to a second page, at the bottom left, you can actually see that it's going to users Caleb Tallien desktop second page.html. And this actually doesn't exist. So when I click this link, it goes to a 404 page. 404 just means your page doesn't exist. It says your file was not found, it may have been moved or deleted. Emphasis on that, if you're moving files from one folder to another folder, it may be moved or deleted. And basically it's saying that the file doesn't exist. So let's go ahead and make this file exist. I'm going to close this tab because that's not needed. And let's do this. I'm going to copy this whole page and I'm going to go File, Save As. And wherever you have hello world.html, let's call this one second page.html. Save. And so now we have a second page.html, and I can file open or Command O or Control O and open up hello world. And now we have 2 files side by side. So the second page one, what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete pretty much everything inside of the body. So let's go and delete all this stuff. Let's change the title to second page. And let's say an H1. This is the second page. That's all we're going to do. So I saved that. And when I come back here, this now exists at this file location on my computer. And if I hit refresh, it actually works. So if I go back, refresh this just for good housekeeping. If I refresh this and I say this goes to second page, it was 404 and it was saying there was a missing file or a missing page. Now it's not. Now it's going to actually load the page for me. Lastly, on our second page, let's go ahead and add one more anchor link back to our hello world page. And let's say hello world.html. Now the thing to keep in mind here is this is not an absolute link. It does not start with HTTP. It is not an absolute link. This just says go to this particular file, which happens to be in the same folder as second page. So these are side by side in the same folder. And it's going to say, oh, look for this particular file. So it's actually linking to another file, not necessarily a web page. And that gets a little bit into how pages are actually served on a server, basically because a server is just someone else's computer. But this one could say, go back to home. Save, refresh. Let's go back to home. I'm going to make that just a touch bigger here. So this is our second page. Go back to home. And we now have 2 pages that link to each other. And if you give this a shot and you get this to work, that means you have successfully created a network of pages. You don't just have a web page now, you have a web site. Okay, let's take a look at opening a link in a new window. So we probably all know that you can control or command click a link, and this is going to open up in a new tab. And maybe we don't want that. Maybe we want to force people to, every time they click a link, open in a new tab, which could be the same as right-clicking and open link in new tab. But if we want to force this on someone, we actually have that power. So I'm going to go over to helloworld.html. And for Google, every time they go to an external page, because this is an internal page or a relative page, and this is an external website or an absolute link, we can say target is equal to, and this one looks a little weird, there's an underscore there, but target is equal to blank. And so this is our attribute, is equal to apostrophe, underscore blank is the value, has to be that underscore blank, and then our closing attribute quotation mark. Let's go ahead and save that, and let's just refresh this page. And now it doesn't look like anything has changed, but when I click this, I'm not going to command click or control click. I'm not going to right click and click open link in new tab. I'm just going to click this link and it's going to open in a new tab for me automatically. Just like that, we now have two tabs. And so that's how you open a link in a new tab. All right, let's look at adding an image to our page. So for an image, we actually need an image file. And I like to go to this place called unsplash.com. And we can just use free royalty-free images. And I just want any image. It doesn't really matter what the image is, although this one is pretty perfect. It has a laptop. That's pretty much what I want. Click, and I'm going to download this. And I'm going to download the largest one that I want, just so I can really make, I guess, a good example of this in just a second. Well, maybe not too large. That's a pretty big image. But let's download the large one. And now this is going to go into my downloads folder. And I actually want this to live beside my Hello World and second page. And that's on my desktop. So I need to open up that folder and move it into my desktop. Otherwise, this is not going to work. So if I just copy this file here, go over to my desktop, paste it, and where are you? Right there. Let's call this Caleb's image. It's not actually my image. I didn't take this image. XPS took this image, but I'm going to call it Caleb's image just for the sake of keeping it simple. So let's go back to here, and then let's go, let's close that. We don't need that open anymore. And let's go to VS Code. And now let's add an image. Now this is interesting because images don't have text. So does it need a closing tag? And the answer actually is no. So let's go ahead and create an H3 in here. H3, let's call this images. And to create a new image is the img tag. It's not image, it's img. Now if I close this, there's actually two ways to close this. So this is a self-closing tag, meaning it does not have /image. That's not how this one works because there's no text, there's nothing else to display. Instead, we're going to use an attribute. And so we can just say there's an image here, and you might actually see it close like this. This is called XHTML. This is an older way of doing things and totally valid still. I write a lot of code this way because I'm a little older school, but it's still completely valid. Or you can just write img, and you want the source of the image, the src for source, is equal to Caleb's image dot. Now this is important. You need to know that file extension. And that file extension here was .jpeg, JPG. Now if yours is uppercase .jpg like this or like this, make sure it matches. It has to be perfect. So mine was not that. Mine was .jpg. I can go ahead and save this, and let's scroll down to where it's supposed to show up, and we're going to see this giant image. And this is actually why I wanted this huge image here, is because this was a really large image. Now, cool, the image showed up, but it's just way too big. Now what we can do is we can add a second attribute. We can say the width is supposed to be, and this is going to be in pixels, let's say 500. Let's go ahead and save that. And what this is going to do is make that image a width of 500 and automatically scale the height for me. So if I right click and inspect, what's cool about this, it says width 500, but you can actually see as I hover over the image, it says the image is 500 by 281 by 0.25. Now, if we wanted to skew this, and I don't know why you would want to, but if you ever wanted to skew an image, you can add a width and a height. And you could say the height is going to be, let's say 200. So this is going to look a little bit off now. You can see it's a little bit squishier. Let's make this pretty extreme and change the height to 100. So now we have 500 by 100. If I hover over, you can actually see over in my viewport, it says IMG 500 by 100. Now, maybe we don't want to scale an image by its width. Maybe we want to scale it by its height. And there will be times where you want to scale an image by its height or just its width, one or the other, not necessarily both. So let's say for whatever reason, we're working with a designer and the designer says, no, the image has to be a maximum height of 100 pixels. We say, okay, height is equal to 100, save, and let's go ahead and refresh. This is now a height of 100 and a width, whatever that automatically was, is 177.77, and our browser works that out for us. So just as a recap, we could say we have an image element. There's no closing tag because, well, what are we going to close? There's no content to put between two tags. We're using attributes here. The source, the src, is equal to Caleb's image.jpg, and this could also be a link to a particular image on the web like http website.com/image.jpg. It could be something like that. It can use absolute or relative URLs, and so we're using a relative URL. We have a second attribute, width is equal to 500. Third attribute, height is equal to 100, and this makes our really weird looking image. And this entire thing is the image element. Now there's a lot more we could add, and actually I'm going to add this in here anyways. Two things. Let's go ahead, because this is getting kind of big. Let's throw this on separate lines, just because, we can, because whitespace doesn't matter. And let's add an alt. And alt is going to be the text that shows up when a screen reader is trying to read your image, trying to describe what the image is, or if the text, or not the text, but if the image breaks, what text to show. So show me. And let's go ahead and change this to .missing.image. So this is not a file on my computer. This is not going to work. This image is going to break for me. And you can see broken image and it says show me. That's the alt text. And if I just undo that, I'm just changing it back to my regular image here. The alt text doesn't show up. That's perfect. We don't want it to show up. We want the image to show up. But just in case the image doesn't show up, we have a fallback. So that's how we add an image. What I would like you to do now is add an image to your page, to your Hello World page. Remember, you can get any sort of images you want from unsplash.com and just use any image that you like. It doesn't really matter what the image is. Okay, welcome back. Hello, hello, hello. In the last video, we created an image. We used the src, width, height, and the alt attributes. In this video, in this lesson, what we're going to do is make this a link, because if I go back to my page, I can't click that. It goes nowhere. And we need this to actually go somewhere. Well, we don't need to, but maybe we want this to. Maybe we want this to go to our second page.html. So let's go ahead and wrap our image in an anchor. So we say href is equal to, and I can fill that in just a second. I'm going to select that, and all I'm doing is tabbing this in, just because I am pretty keen on nice tabbing. And then we do /a. So we have an opening tag and a closing tag, and that means it's going to go around our image. And then for our href, let's do second page.html. And that's going to go to our second page.html. And so if I refresh this, it looks like nothing's changed, but I can now actually click it. And you can see at the bottom left there, it says second page.html. If I click this, it goes to my page. Go back home, scroll on down, and now we have an image that goes to another page. Now, all we've really done here is nested an image inside of an anchor tag. And this is why nesting was really important to learn to begin with. We learned about images, we learned about anchor tags, and now we're just mixing the two together. So what I would like you to do is this exact same thing. Grab an image, whatever image from unsplash.com, make sure it shows up on your page, and then link to another page. You could even just link to google.com if you wanted to, or some other web page out there if you don't have a second page already built out. You can link to anywhere on the internet, your Facebook profile, your LinkedIn profile, anything like that. Alrighty, hello. Let's take a look at horizontal rules and line breaks. So first things first, I'm going to work on one of the paragraphs that we actually have at the very beginning. We created these two paragraphs here. And so I've got a paragraph and I've got a second paragraph. And let's say I want some sort of line in between them. I have this thing called an HR, a horizontal rule. And because it doesn't take any text inside of it, it does not need a closing tag. Again, this is a self-closing tag, just like image. Let's go ahead and save this. And it should show up right in here. And so when I go and refresh, bam, there it is. It shows up right there. And a horizontal rule is a block element. It's going to take up the full width, as you can see. It takes up the full width, and all it is a line between your text. So it's really good for separating headers or content or things like that. Now, the other thing I wanted to show you was a BR tag. So we have a horizontal rule, but we also have a BR tag. So let's say we wanted to separate this onto its own line, but not its own paragraph, but we wanted it to look like this. So we have our first line of lorem here, and then audio, sunt, whatever, is on its own line as well. Okay, so I just saved that, and VS Code just automatically fixed that up for me. So if I go back to the page, nothing's changed. And again, that's because in HTML, whitespace is not important. Your browser doesn't care about it. What it does care about is if you want a new line, you can just type BR. And this is simply a line break, BR for break. And if I save and refresh my page, we're going to see that right here is going to be a new line, just like that. So this started a new line over here. And now we have a horizontal rule and a line break side by side. Or I guess not side by side, but you know, in the same lesson. What I would like you to do is give both of those a shot. This is super easy. Shouldn't take you more than about 30 seconds, maybe 60 seconds. Create a horizontal rule and then create a line break inside of a paragraph. Let's take a look at HTML comments. So a comment is basically a piece of code you can write, and that's not going to be executed by your browser. And it looks like this. So it's less than sign. You can see that all of our HTML elements look like that. One of those weird times where we actually see an exclamation mark, and then a dash, and then we can put our text here. And then it ends with a dash, and then a greater than sign. And so if I save this, and it typically, so far, it would show up above my Welcome to HTML 101 text. But if I go back here, hit refresh, it doesn't show up at all. However, if I right click, view page source, there it is. So don't ever put passwords, secrets, credit cards, answers to anything. Don't put anything secret in there because it's not actually secret. It is 100% accessible to all of your users. So this is not a good place to write secrets. What it is good for is explaining what we're doing. So we can say, this is a tutorial. And let's maybe break this onto separate lines. This is a tutorial course on HTML. We are learning HTML from scratch. And so again, I can save that, come back here, refresh my source code. You can see the source code has actually changed. Go back here, refresh the actual page, and it's not rendered. And this is called an HTML comment. So I say this is an HTML comment. Now what's really cool about this is you can actually comment out existing code as well. So let's go ahead and comment this out. So let's do the opening sign, and you can see it turned all of my text gray all the way down to my page, to the bottom of my page. And let's go over here and close that, and you can see the syntax highlighting kicks in again, lets me know that things are working the way I want them to work. Save that, and because I have commented this out, it's still going to show up in the source code. We see it here, it's in the source code. But because it's between an opening and closing comment syntax, let's refresh, and we can see that it no longer shows up. The browser says it's a comment, do not execute it, do not render it. It's really just a useless piece of text to the browser. It's more useful to humans than it is to computers. And that's an HTML comment. Now you're going to see some of these every now and then. It's not too often you see these, but when you do see them, just know that this is the stuff that's not going to show up when you load your page. Okay, let's take a look at lists. There are two types of lists. There's an ordered list and an unordered list, and we'll demo both of these. Now this is interesting because this is one of those elements that requires nesting. And again, it's important to know about nesting here. So I'm going to throw a title in here called lists. Now the first one I want to tackle is an ordered list, an OL. Now we could say something in here, and let's preview this. Scroll down my page and it says something in here, but it doesn't actually know what to do. It's sort of like a list, but if I wanted to make a second bullet point, this just doesn't work. What we can do is say, because this is a list, it needs a list item. And all I'm doing here is saying list item opening tag, list item closing tag, and now we have two elements that are nested inside of our ordered list. So save and refresh, and now it lists for us. 1, 2, 3, so on, so on, so on. It counts for us. I didn't write 1, I didn't write 2. That's an ordered list. Now an unordered list, very, very similar, but it's not going to have the counting. It's just going to have bullet points. So I could do UL, and then I could do LI, and this is a list item. Hit tab because I have that emit abbreviation. Point number 1, copy that entire line down to the one below it, point 2, copy that entire line to the one below it, and I'm just using Control C and Control V, or Command C and Command V. And that copies my entire line for me. Let's go ahead and save that. And refresh. And we have bullet points. And so as we progress through HTML, you're getting a little bit more familiar with nesting and opening and closing tags and attributes and things like that. This is going to get a lot easier. And you've probably already noticed that if you've gone through all of the videos up until this point, that an ordered list, you already sort of know the syntax. You know that this is a nested element and that there's some text in there and that it has a closing and an opening tag. And then if we want another one, we just have another child element. So we've got a child li here, and the parent ol. And at this point, it's getting really, really easy for you to learn. And an example of that is the unordered list. So an ordered list has the numbering, obviously, because it's called an ordered list, but an unordered list doesn't have it. It just has bullet points. But the syntax is almost identical. The only thing we've changed here really is from OL to UL. And so you can see from here on out that learning HTML is just going to get faster and faster and faster. You're already learning all of the basics very, very quickly. So that's how we make a list. If you would like to pause the video here, go ahead, hit pause and try this out on your own. Make sure it shows up in your browser. When you're nice and ready, let's head on over to that next lesson. Let's talk about CSS tags. So this one is really interesting. We've only actually dealt with one element inside of our head, but with CSS, we could put it anywhere, but typically we put it in our head. And this one is a style. This is a style element. And what I'm saying here is CSS, and this stands for Cascading Style Sheets. There we go. Cascading style sheets. And I can comment that out so it doesn't actually show up in the browser. Now, what's interesting here is this does not accept HTML. Isn't that weird? So we're writing HTML, but this does not accept HTML. And at this point, we're getting into this thing called CSS, Cascading Style Sheets, which is a way for us to style our page. What this does take is CSS Markdown, Markup. Yeah, CSS language. And this is very, very different. This does not look like HTML at all. And you do not need to know this for this particular course, but this is a good transition into what you would be learning next. So let's say we wanted to change the entire background color to black, and we wanted to change all the color, the text color, to white. We can do that. We can say body, and you can see that this matches the element. And all we're going to do is an opening curly brace, background dash color, and you can see VS Code is very helpful. It's helping me understand what I'm supposed to be writing. Change that to black. And then I can change the font color, and you can actually see that MDN reference shows up. Sets the color of an element's text, color, white. And so this is going to select this element, the body, and everything in it, and it's going to try to apply these rules to it. So if I go back here and hit refresh, check that out. Our page now has white text with a black background. Now again, this is not something you need to know, and honestly I would say don't learn it, but I needed to show you what this is because you're going to see this style element all over the place. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to comment this out as well, refresh my page and bring it back to normal. Now, if you wanted to, by all means, give this a shot. Feel free to experiment with it, but know that you still have a lot more HTML to learn. You need to learn how to add videos and audio and things like that. And you need to learn those things before we learn CSS, or at least you should. That's a lot easier to learn one thing at a time instead of learning two things at a time. But if you wanted to experiment, have some fun with it, by all means, go for it. But this is the style tag. This is your CSS. And once again, no, you don't need to know this. I just wanted to show you this. Just as a heads up, you're going to see this tag in the wild in other source code that you view, like on google.com, for instance. There's going to be some in there. Facebook.com probably has some. Instagram.com probably has some style elements inside of their HTML. So it's a common thing. And I just wanted to make sure you would be familiar with it. All right, we're done with CSS. Let's head on over to the next one where we learn basically the same concept, but for JavaScript. Hello and welcome to the world of JavaScript. Okay, so there are two things I want to talk about. One is how we add JavaScript to a page. There's a couple ways to do that. And the second way, or the second thing I want to talk about is do not learn JavaScript right now. It's going to be very tempting. You're going to hear people in Facebook groups and learning groups and LinkedIn groups and other courses saying you need to learn JavaScript. But that's not true. You need to learn HTML before you learn JavaScript. JavaScript is used to modify and work with HTML. And if you don't know HTML very well, you're not going to be able to learn JavaScript. So you need HTML first. That said, I'm going to show you how to add some JavaScript in here. So it starts with the script tag. And in here, again, because it's HTML, it doesn't really care about whitespace. However, we do not write HTML in here. We don't. We write JavaScript. We write JavaScript, or JS for short, in here. That is what's important, okay? So always remember that. I see a lot of people trying to write like a div inside of their script and it doesn't work, and that's because anything between the two script tags here, the opening and closing tag, your browser thinks is JavaScript and not HTML. And that's important to know because if you've taken my other course about web fundamentals, there are different engines in your browser. You have an engine for rendering HTML, an engine for rendering CSS, and an engine for rendering JavaScript. And it's saying, hey, use the JavaScript engine for this, not the HTML one. So let's go ahead and create an example here. Hello world. And you do not need to know this right now, but this is JavaScript. And all this is going to do is when I load the page, it's going to give me a little pop-up. So when I go back to my page, hit refresh, it says hello world, and then it shows my page. So it's executing the JavaScript and then the HTML. So that's one way. The other way you're going to see this tag being used is script. And what happens if I click this button? Oh, right there, that's perfect. Is instead of having all of your code in your page, you can have this code in another file, like test.javascript.js, and you don't need that in here. You can get rid of that, and that code can live in another file. And so all we're saying here is use the script tag. So, hey, Chrome, Firefox, Safari, Edge, there's a JavaScript that I want you to render in here. The source, just like an image, let's scroll back up, just like an image, src, source, is equal to, and then whatever the file name is. Now this is a relative file, a lot like this relative link. So it should be in the same folder. Now, if this doesn't exist, nothing's going to happen. If this does exist, but there's nothing in there, nothing's going to happen. You actually need some JavaScript to execute. And again, that's not something we need to know right now. But what I'm going to do is, boom, comment that out. And that's just an HTML comment. And that makes sure that my browser says, hey, anything between this opening tag and this closing tag or the syntax, don't render it. It's allowed to live in there in the source code, but do not actually execute it. And if I go back to Chrome and I refresh the page, that alert goes away. So perfect. Now again, you do not need to know this. The reason why I wanted to show you this is because you're going to see scripts a lot. In today's modern web, there is a lot of JavaScript. And again, you need to know HTML in order to know JavaScript very well. But you're going to see a lot of scripts all over the place. And so when you see this, just know that everything in between the opening and closing script tag is actually going to be JavaScript and not HTML or CSS. Okie dokie, let's take a look at one cool thing here. So while you're learning to write code, you're going to want to be able to share your code with people. And it's really, really hard to safely share this kind of code with people. People put their files in zips and then share them in Facebook groups, and it looks really spammy and nobody knows if it's actually safe to download. And then if you have a question, your question doesn't get answered. It's just this whole thing that you want to avoid. There is a better way. So what you can do is you can go to CodePen.io. And I want to create a new pen. Oh, look at that, all sorts of stuff. But I just want to create a regular new pen in here. And what this is going to do is give me HTML, CSS, and JavaScript to work with. Now, at this particular time, if you're taking this course, you probably don't need to know JavaScript, and you probably don't need to know CSS. You probably just need to know HTML. Now, in here, you can write anything. Hello world. And it just takes a second, but it does. It eventually renders for you. Now, the thing is, you do not need your doc type. You do not need HTML. You do not need body. You don't need those tags. What you do need is everything between the body tag all the way down to the closing body tag. Right there. So we can now copy, right click, paste, and this isn't necessarily going to show my images because, well, I'm saying, hey, CodePen, look for not second page, but Caleb's image.jpg. And this is where the alt text kicks in. And so it can't find that because it doesn't know. It's a website. It's not on my computer. And so it's looking for Caleb's image.jpg on the server. On someone else's computer, they don't have it yet, so that's not going to work. So just a heads up there. But, you know, as you're writing more and more HTML and CSS and JavaScript down the road, you can do all of this in a CodePen. Now, the nice thing is you can name this. So, hello world. Let's go ahead and save that. And I just created a free CodePen account, by the way. It's completely free. You do not need to pay for CodePen. So please, while you're learning, do not pay for CodePen. You never need to pay for it. And you get this nice little link. And so if I open this up in another tab, I just copied and pasted that link. It shows up. And if I have another tab, paste it in there, it shows up. And what's really nice is it's saving all of your code. And so if you need to share your code in the Learning to Code Facebook group or in a project section on this platform, or really you need to share your code with a friend or a developer or a mentor or anyone whatsoever, even if you just want to show this off to your spouse, your friends, your family, you can just send them this link with all the code in it. This is a really, really good way to share your code, and it's a safe way to share your code, so people don't have to worry about downloading weird zip files or Google Drive or using Dropbox or anything like that. It's just simply CodePen, and tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of people are using CodePen. It is completely safe. It's been around for a very long time. It's not going anywhere. This is a good service to use when you need to share your code. So when you're sharing your code, please share your CodePen link. Okay, if you need some extra support, I have a massive support group for you. So obviously you can ask questions down below. Please do, if that's your thing, ask questions down below. But if you want answers right away, like within minutes, sometimes even seconds, you're going to want to join some sort of support group. Now, learning HTML is actually quite easy. It's considered one of the easiest things to learn in web development. But that doesn't mean it's easy for everybody. And so if you need a little extra support, you can go to facebook.com and let's search in here for Learning to Code. And this group currently has 56,905 members. This is a group that I've created a long time ago. And again, there's 56,000 members in there. There's questions being asked all the time, people answering things all the time. For example, hi self-coders, my name is Dragos. He's got a good question in here, 132 comments. If I keep scrolling down, I participate in this. It is my group. Who here is interested in learning how web requests and web responses work? 59 comments. Okay, and I posted that 11 hours ago. So there's a lot of discussion in here, but you can ask questions like, how do I make something bold? How do I make something italic? Why is my code not working? Then share your CodePen link, please. Don't show a screenshot. I would highly recommend not showing a screenshot. I would highly recommend not copying and pasting your code into the Facebook group. Share it on CodePen. or with CodePen rather. So if you need any additional support, definitely join the Learning to Code Facebook group. It's completely free. You don't have to sign up for anything. It's completely free. It's just a nice little value add that I like to give to my students. But again, even that's optional. You don't have to. But if you would like a little extra support with timely responses, that is a really good place to be. Okay, let's take a look at your project. Your project is going to be relatively easy. You don't have to do everything in here. And remember, you don't have to memorize everything we've written in this course. You can always just Google it too. So if you're like, oh, I know what an H1 is, but I don't remember exactly how to make a link, that's fine. You could Google it. You type into Google, HTML link tutorial, and you're going to find hundreds, thousands, maybe even millions of pages that are going to show you exactly how to add a link. So remember, you don't need to actually remember all of this. All you need to know is how to find the answer. And that's honestly about 50% of any job as a web developer these days, is just knowing how to find the answers, not memorizing them, but being able to find the answers. So moving on to the project here, what I would like you to do is I would like you to create a new .html file. Then I would like you to create a header, so like an H1, subheader about like what you do, what you want to get into, anything like that. Add an image, and lastly, add a link to your Twitter, Insta, Facebook. It doesn't really matter. Just make sure you have at least one link. So let's do this. Create a 2.1. This would be a good time for a nested ordered list, by the way. 2.2. All right, so I just formatted that a little nicer just so that we could all read it together. So create a new HTML file. Make sure you've got a header in there, put your name in there, a subheader like your title, your work description, a favorite hobby, anything like that. Add an image of anything. I would say add an image of yourself. It's totally safe because it's just going to be on your computer. But if you would rather share your project with an image of something else, that's totally okay too. You can always go to unsplash.com and get a free image. Lastly, add a link to either your Twitter, your Instagram, or your Facebook, or just add a link to Google or something. The important part here is that you're going to add a link. So go ahead and give that a shot. If you ever get stuck, don't forget you can reference the other videos, or you can continue watching this video and I'll show you exactly how I do it. But I would like you to pause this video here and give this project a shot. Don't forget to share your project down below on this platform, if this platform offers that kind of feature. Otherwise, you can always share your progress with the Learning to Code Facebook group. So pause your video here. I'm going to give this about 5 seconds and then I'm going to resume playing and I'm going to show you exactly how I do this. Okay, so I'm going to create this project. I'm going to show you exactly how I do it. So first things first, new file. And I just did Command N, or you could go to File, New File. Save that. I'm going to save this to my desktop, and I'm going to call this caleb.html because this is my portfolio page. This is what I want to do. I need that HTML5 stuff in here. So I don't need the meta. We didn't talk about that. That's a little more advanced. And I don't need lang is equal to English. Again, that's a little more advanced. We don't need to worry about that. I'm going to change the title to Caleb's page. And what did I need to add in here? I needed to add a header that's 2.1 in this list. So a header H1. I'm going to put my name in here, Caleb Tallien. H2, I needed a subheader. So let's put something smaller in here, like an H3. Senior developer. And I am a premium coding instructor. That's my role in life. The role I have given myself. 2.3, add an image. Okay. So I already know that I have one image in here. It's not an image of me, but it is an image. And this is from a previous lesson. So I can do image src is equal to Caleb's image.jpg, and that's just in the same folder as this file. All of this lives on my desktop. It's in the same folder. Alt, Caleb Tallien, and I want to give this a width, so it's not huge, of, I don't know, like 400. Lastly, I need a paragraph, right? No. I needed a link. but also I'm going to add a paragraph anyways. I don't really want to write a whole paragraph, so I'm going to throw some lorem in here. And then I needed a link to, let's say, Twitter. So this link could just be an anchor tag. href is equal to https twitter.com/Caleb Tallien. You can also find me on Instagram if that's your jam. And let's put @Caleb Tallien. And that's all there is to it. So I can go back to my browser and I can go File, Open File, and open up caleb.html. Let's hope I don't have any typos in there because that's going to be a little bit embarrassing. And boom, there is my HTML page. I've got an H1, I've got an H3 for my subtitle, I've got an image, and I have some lorem text in there. I just sort of threw that in willy-nilly at the last minute there, and a link to my Twitter, which brings me right to Twitter. And that's all there is to it. So I went pretty fast there, and I did that on purpose so that you'd have to pause and you might have to think a little bit harder. I want you to really work at something like this. But when you're done, please share your progress down below. Lastly, thank you so much for taking the time to take this course. I hope you learned something great and fun and new. And if you ever want to check out any of my other courses, just hit the link to my profile on this platform. You can see all of my courses are available here as well, including what to learn next, such as more advanced HTML, CSS, JavaScript, Python, PHP, a bunch of projects in between, all sorts of stuff. Thanks again for taking this course, and I hope to see you in another one.